Here's Eric Evans again with some additional insight into entities. Steve has asked him how entities align with a single responsibility principle. If you're not familiar with this object-oriented programming principle, you can learn more about it in Steve's Solid course here on Pluralsight.
Eric, one of the questions that I've heard is, what's the single responsibility for an entity? Or to put it another way, does having an entity that has a lot of business logic in it violate the single responsibility principle in object-oriented programming? Or how would you reconcile that?
I would reconcile it by saying that I don't think an entity ought to have a lot of different business logic in it. Now, I do think that these entities are very central, and so it's natural that they get heaped up with lots of functionality. But if you do that, you have a couple of hits, and one of them is that as you build out the system, there are more and more conflicting demands on these central entities. So they end up being huge. It's not unusual to find entities with 6 or 100 or 1,000 methods and members and so forth. So I don't think that's good. The responsibility that I would focus the design of an entity on is, or I guess you could say, two very closely related responsibilities. That is the identity and the life cycle. And so the identity isn't just an ID field. There are some situations where you just put an ID on an object and it pretty much takes care of it. That's if the domain has been structured to allow that. For example, if you are a UPS shipping a package, the first thing that happens is that tracking ID gets assigned to that package and it stays with it to the very end. And so there's not much else involved in the identity of a package. But that is not always the case, like especially in domains where there are people involved. You will often find that just stamping an ID onto, say, a customer is not really going to cover it. You might, for example, have to have a phone call from that person, and you have to figure out, well, is that person actually customer number 3275628? They don't know that number to tell you, or if they do, you still might want to verify it for yourself. So you ask them their name. Of course, that doesn't confidently identify someone, but it's evidence. You ask them their phone number. There may be some secret information about them. That's one case where identity becomes something more complex. Now, actually, when it gets to be really complex, I don't want to put the responsibility for even that onto the entity. So sometimes identity matching becomes such an elaborate thing that I would have another object that was responsible for, or a set of functions that were responsible for that. But let's get back to something more typical. You've got an entity. Maybe most of the time you can manage with that ID field, and it goes through some life cycle. A UPS package goes through some life cycle, like received by them, I suppose, and then shipped, and in transit it moves from one location to another, and then finally it is delivered to a customer. Maybe there's a receipt that they get, someone has to sign something. So there's a basic life cycle that one of those packages goes through. But if there's much other logic besides that, and I bet there is, we want to start using some other source of logic. You might want some services that can can answer questions about what should be done with the package. You might want to have, even for the logic that core entity is doing for itself, it might delegate it to value objects, so that all the entity is really doing, saying some simple question about its status or about what should be done with it next or something like that. And the value objects interact to answer the question, or some service is invoked to answer the question. What I'm getting at here is that I think single responsibility is a good principle to apply to entities, and the pattern is kind of pointing you toward the sort of responsibility that an entity ought to retain. And anything that doesn't fall in that category, we ought to put somewhere else, delegate somewhere else, or put in a service or something like that.